Hello and welcome to our presentation. My name is Katina Michael. I'm a professor at the School for the Future of Innovation in Society and also the School for Computing, Informatics and Decision Systems Engineering. And I'm here today with Dr. Roba Abbas from the University of Wollongong in the Faculty of Business. And we've been invited by Moira Patterson of IEEE Standards Association for the Digital Inclusion, Identity, Trust and Agency project. Sorry we can't be with you in Vienna today, but we're hoping that this recording will be making up for our remoteness. We're giving a presentation today on caring for children online, co-designing in the public interest. And for those of us who are parents, this topic is really dear to our heart. And even if we're not, we have nephews and nieces or friends who have children. And this has become a hot issue. So we're very happy to be talking about this today as it forms a great part of our research. So just to frame the context, we're talking about children, responsibility and care, and who is really responsible for children's care online? That's the real question here. If we believe the COPPA rules, children online are those that are under the age of 13. So anyone under the age of 13 is not only a minor, but also a child. This can be seen online if we look at innocent games like In the Night Garden, for example. And this is an example of a webcam test page, which asks a child whether they would like their webcam to be switched on. Of course, that assumes that a child can read, they haven't just pressed the OK button, and that there is a parent there that is allowing the child permission to actually access the webcam, which then allows them through a local connection to the computer to enter the game. On the flip side, then we have help centers like those available on applications and social media sites like Facebook. And Facebook here in its help pages identifies that it requires everyone who registers with them and creates an account to be at least 13 years of age. But the question begs, how do we police that? Care online involves meeting the needs of ourselves and others who are dependent and vulnerable. And we could look at things like bring your own device agreements that schools in elementary and high school and middle school actually provide agreement policies for users. And so parents read this agreement and students read this agreement and they sign off and submit their agreement policies to the school. But really, is this shifting the blame or the responsibility away from schools towards parents and end users, many of whom are minors? We've got examples like the #WakeUpInstagram movement, which is really about trying to minimize how individual children are being attacked, perhaps via different types of trafficking online, bullying and abuse, and even pedophile-like comments regarding photos. So the first thing is the child having access to an Instagram account, and we know how many children who are not 13 actually do have access, and many of them lie about their age to actually gain entry. But then you have these additional networks, dark networks, that form to actually pry on children. But how do we actually get around these issues when children are being inadvertently or indirectly, perhaps is a better term, abused online? And then you have example toys. This is one of the first internet-enabled toys, Video Girl, which invited young people over the age of 6 was the recommended age to engage in play activity through a device like the Video Girl that would record via a body-worn device independent of Barbie. And then young people could go online and record, as we can see at the bottom of this screen in the middle. They could record and then edit their videos and share them using Mattel's software. And so all of these internet-enabled devices created a new type of avenue for understanding what care online and responsibility was about. So if I've been cared for, I have a responsibility to care for others in the context of their digital services usage. And this is really what this presentation is about. How do we care for one another, especially children, and who has responsibility for this care while our kids and those known to us are online? As one example, recently Google and in particular YouTube were fined $170 million for alleged violations of children's privacy. And now what we've seen is a reaction from Google and YouTube in instituting a better way to have acceptable videos being, shown to children. And so when you upload a video now, you're asked, who is your audience? Is it made for kids or is it not made for kids? Is the material for viewers over the age of 18 or no? Don't restrict viewers to over the age of 18. So we can see that organizations are attempting to respond to these penalties that they've suffered, but also we're reaching a maturity stage where we're asking more direct questions about responsibility. And this was only a matter of time as the market, which was completely deregulated, is now starting to form some rules of engagement with those people who are children and those who are not. Another issue, another example, for instance, was Snapchat's map functionality, which allowed for location-based social networking to occur. And when the app was originally launched as a feature of Snapchat, children and parents and the community was not really warned about the capacity for maps to be used in location sharing. And as we saw, even post the outcry of schools and parental groups in the UK, for instance, where Snapchat changed its feature to be not by default, but as an opt-in, we still had the abuse of these sophisticated applications. And in one example, a peeping Tom was caught allegedly using the Snapchat app. He masqueraded himself as a teenager under the identity of Ashley Six Cheer and befriended a group of girls. And as the girls would meet up at various times, Snapchat was being used to identify the location of these young ladies. And so we see that even when there are warnings, even when it is an opt-in service, children are not 100% aware of the capacity of the applications out there, and you do have the ability to misuse and abuse these apps. We now have toys that listen, a study of parents, in this case, children and internet-connected toys. It's not just about toys that listen now, it's also about visual toys, but with the IoT movement and the estimated number of IoT devices at 20 billion in 2020 is just showing us the magnitude of the question and the issues we have to overcome when it comes to children and the marketing of toys. So if we look at it from a regulatory provisions perspective and we look at stakeholder types, this work really came out of the work on location-based services by Dr. Abbas in the mid-2000s to late 2000s, who is responsible for children's care online. And so we have stakeholder types here on the left, and we have regulatory provisions. And you can see that a child, for instance, really can't self-regulate. They haven't reached that age of maturity and awareness that they're able to self-regulate. And usually there are provisions under child protection laws. We've got parents who help to enforce self-regulation in the house, and they can self-regulate and then perhaps guide their children using particular developmental guidelines that are available. We've got schools that also self-regulate and have their own user agreements, as we saw, but also the school is having a mutual agreement between the parent and child. And again, the question asks, is that agreement really valid when a child is under the age of maybe 13? We've got companies offering products and applications and content, and they adhere to industry sort of co-regulation standards. As an example, we have the Communications Alliance in Australia. We have a regulator, again, as an example, the Australian Communications Media Authority. We have government who also regulate through legislation, for example, the eSafety Commissioner's Office. And then we have law enforcement like the Australian Federal Police that are there to enforce that legislation. And you have programs like the Think You Know campaign, which are there to encourage media literacy among parents and children. So suggestions for addressing age-appropriate digital services are quite tricky. We could look at examples like in South Korea, where the real name and the national security number are used as IPINs, they're internet personal identification numbers, and you can't log on without that user ID and that password. And that's a government administered unique identification. In other countries, they've suggested education unique identities for students, and still we have app providers now that require individual users to maintain an online biometric profile. Usually it's a fingerprint of some sort, and usually that's stored in the secure enclave of the device, but not always. If we look at the Apple brand, for example, that biometric is only actually stored on the smartphone itself, on the iPhone, and is not available for others to actually access in a secure area. But then we have also governments jostling for this information. So the question is, how do we do this? You know, we have all of this technology at our fingertips. But if we look at technology through the ages, really it's not been built for kids. We've had the internet that we're speaking about. We've had global positioning system capability for X and Y longitude and latitude coordinates, which was a government and really a defense-oriented system. And then it was selective availability was switched off. We've had CCTV cameras, mobile technology, smartphones, social media, inbuilt laptop cameras, and biometrics. But really, on this slide, about the only thing that was built for the child, one could argue, was the actual swing. It wasn't really the smartphone, which is allegedly an adult tool, but in the hands of children could be used in the perception or guise of a safety device. So what do we do? And this is where I want to hand over to Roba, because I think she's got the solution. What do you think, Roba?
Oh, well, why don't we step back and have a look at some of the methodologies around that, and then I'll let the audience decide, Katina.
Okay.
Firstly, thank you for the opportunity to present here, and thank you, Katina, for framing this topic area. I think when we start to think about design for kids or design in general, it's pretty helpful to step back and look historically at different kinds of fields and significant developments, particularly in the systems space, right back to general systems theory and progress that's been made since, that allows us to frame the context around care for kids and around design in general, particularly when we start to delve into the participatory design field and certainly co-design as well. So if we look on the screen at the moment, I think before we even attempt to answer this question, we need to think about the underpinnings from a theoretical and methodological perspective. So we approach the issue or the question of how do we design for kids from an informed kind of perspective. And what that requires us to do in the first instance is to acknowledge some developments and the current state of a number of fields. So if I direct your attention to the left-hand side of the screen, when we look at systems or general systems theory, I think that provides us with the underlying assumptions for how we might consider designing for care, particularly where children are concerned. Now, we can apply general systems theory in a number of ways. In regards to this topic area, we can think about the components and the characteristics that systems theory in general provides us, particularly with regards to general open systems. So things to do with environmental factors, boundaries, the interfaces, and the process of transformation or processing itself. Now, I won't go into too much detail in each of these fields because they're quite vast, but I think the takeaway from each of those areas might be a helpful point. So if we start off by thinking of this issue as a systems issue, as an open systems issue, where we're not thinking about caring for kids in isolation, but rather we're caring for kids as they exist within a broader societal system. And there are different units of analysis where that's concerned. So we can think about the child themselves as an individual, the child as they exist within the context of a family, for instance. And we can go further and further out in terms of unit of analysis. And as you can appreciate, this becomes quite complex, and it affords us with a lot of information and a lot of, if you'd like to view it as pieces of a puzzle that we need to really design and think about in terms of deliberate design efforts. Now, when you think about systems in isolation or a systems theory in a general kind of sense, I think we're missing that underlying dynamic between the social elements and the technical elements, which is where we can progress to the massive movement that happened that originated from the Tavistock Institute in socio-technical systems theory. At a fundamental level, and this is well documented, so it's not a new concept, we can think about it in terms of the interactions between complex social and technical subsystems. And within those subsystems, there are sub-elements as well that come into play and that interact in a way that create this complex open system. Now, further delving into this socio-technical space, I think it's really important to pay tribute to the human-computer interaction movement. So in terms of human-computer interaction, by way of short introduction, we can perceive it as an interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary field of study that at a very low level considers contact and engagement between a human element and the technical element. So if we go back historically in terms of human-computer interaction or HCI movement, it's how people use personal computing, how they interact with a graphical user interface, for instance, and with a keyboard and with other aspects related to your standard PC. Now, if we think about it as a contemporary field of study, it's moved beyond this simple interaction to the interaction with complex and intelligent systems. And that's where it becomes quite a challenge when we think about human-computer interaction in the context of design and specifically designing for kids. A fundamental premise of human-computer interaction are its methodologies, which come in the form of participatory approaches. And if we use participation and co-design as a broad umbrella term, we can start to appreciate what that might mean from a design perspective. Now, Katina, if we move to the next page, we can think of participation and design or as an extension of HCI as manifesting itself in a number of different ways in studies that are focused around design for kids and co-designing for kids. So there have been terms, and I won't go into too much detail in terms of what these particular concepts are, but I will speak to the common elements within these particular areas. Now, if you look at something like co-design, participatory design, cooperative inquiry and design, and consultation, which we've documented in a 2018 article, which Katina, I think we provided the details for here. These are all approaches that allow for this participatory engagement with children to varying degrees. And they set out specific and different methodologies, and there are academics and scholars around the world who have attempted in various contexts to use these approaches to engage in participatory design with children. Now, in terms of the takeaways across each of these categories, there are, I'd say, a few important elements that we can take away. In terms of the philosophy of participation and co-design as it pertains to the context of care for children where digital services are concerned. So the first is the idea of stakeholder inclusivity, and I'll pick up on that point as I go through the slides. The second is the fundamental notions of participation and cooperation as being really crucial elements. Now, when we think about participation and cooperation, there's a range or a spectrum, which I'll pick up on again in one of my forthcoming slides. So participation can take on many forms. It can be embedded or integrated or employed in multiple methodologies. And there's a range of, in terms of participation or the degree of input that a child, for instance, might provide in design efforts. The second or the third real aspect here is the idea of intergenerational communication and collaboration, and that's quite key. So a lot of the literature in human-computer interaction and in participatory and co-design historically has focused on the role of the adult end user. Specifically when we're talking about user-centered design, for instance, there hasn't been until, I'd say recently, acknowledgement of the role that a child might have as an expert in their own domain as they use technologies or digital services, the kind of input that they're able to provide into these design processes. And I'd like to pose as part of this presentation, or we'd like to pose the idea that they are an expert in their domain, while they might need structures around the degree of input and that they can provide, given or with certain kinds of guidance, I think they can be very valuable partners in design efforts. So the intergenerational component and the ability to move away from an adult-centered co-design or participatory process is quite crucial, and it's an assumption or something we need to take on board when we decide how we should design for care with children in mind. And the last aspect is the idea of flexibility within a methodology. So while it's important to have a strong, rigorous methodology for engaging in co-design and participatory design, there's research that suggests the importance of flexibility when we're regarding design efforts where students are, children and students are the primary stakeholder group. Now, Katina, if we move on to the next slide, please. I think regardless of which of those methodologies are chosen, and that's very much context dependent, it depends on use, it depends on whether we are talking about applications, technologies, and the unit of analysis will have a part to play as well. I think if we think about some of the fundamental elements that are required for co-design, that's a useful starting point in co-designing with children. In this instance, we're still posing it's co-designing for children. This specific diagram on the slides at the moment is adapted from one of our articles earlier this year, which is very much embedded in the biomedical engineering space, or a case study in biomedical engineering. But I think it gives a really good sense of what the philosophy of co-design actually implies. So if we think about co-design, which is the ability to design in conjunction with users and other stakeholders, we can think about it as requiring three facets, if you like. The first, and which is one of the most important, is the ability to create a shared space. Now, this shared space creates a comfortable environment where, which is conducive to collaboration and encourages children in this instance to provide input into design efforts. And we speak more about that in the paper cited on the screen. Now, when we think about this shared space, this is one of the most essential components for a co-design effort to be successful. Additionally, we need to think about a secondary component, which is a set of factors which correspond to a number of elements. So these factors really address the kinds of stakeholder types which Katina has already alluded to and spoken about from a regulatory perspective, that are required to be involved in co-design efforts. And there are different configurations for those stakeholder types and the type of engagement and input, which I will touch on in a second as well. So we'll develop on this idea of stakeholder selection in the next few slides. Now, the second is the tool or methodology of choice, as per my previous slide. So the context will very much dictate the type of methodology that we'll choose for engagement, again, dependent on the nature of the socio-technical open system itself. The last point is aspects relating to the physical location, and studies in co-design claim that this is quite crucial to choose a physical area that allows this co-design process to take place in the most appropriate kind of fashion. Now, these factors are beyond the scope of our discussion here today, but it's really important to set the basis for future discussions in this area. Now, the third facet that I'd like to talk about is the idea of features and assumptions. And these are features and assumptions we inherit as soon as we say that we are engaging in any kind of participatory or co-design effort. And they are these assumptions that we always need to include stakeholders. So it's the idea of stakeholder inclusivity. We need to be engaging also in a pragmatic approach to our research. And if we revert back to the assumptions and the principles and characteristics we inherit from systems theory, we need to engage in co-design in an objective-driven fashion. And anyone aware of systems theory, we're always creating a system for a specific objective, and it's a unified objective. In this instance, when we adopt a socio-technical perspective, it is an objective which allows for diverse interests to be accounted for and to be jointly optimized when we think of a social element and a technical element. And the last is experience-based. So I referred to that idea earlier on, that children are experts in their own domain. They know what they require. They need to be empowered to be able to share that knowledge with a broader design team, and we need to be able to frame the manner in which they provide guidance and to sort of direct them in that process. So I'm going to pick up on one element in the next slide, which is that participatory element. So how do we design for kids, and how do we incorporate their feedback? The table that you can see on screen is an adapted form of an article or a segment of an article that we wrote about last year, and cites other work in the field where we can think of things in terms of a range of input, right from limited input through to continual active role in design processes. And this is quite important because depending on how we decide to develop and create our co-design process, we will obtain varied feedback or different types of feedback. So in a limited sense, we can obtain feedback from a child as an observer of a specific online service, for instance. So that's at one end where it's minimal input in co-design efforts, but still provides us some form of information that we can use. We can then move on to additional layers and levels of detail in terms of eliciting feedback, where we treat the children as users of the technology, and they're able to provide richer experience around or contributing to design efforts. And then we can go through in terms of testers of current and new prototypes. They can be informants throughout the process, where we dip in and out in terms of eliciting their feedback and obtaining their requirements around specific digital or online services. But ideally, a co-design effort should be striving for that last element, which is a child or kids as design partners. And what that implies is that the child will continually be providing feedback and will assume a very active role in the design process and in the design methodology, right from the beginning, so as a precursor to the first prototype, right through to the diffusion of the actual digital service in the market and its use and so on. So I think it's really necessary, if we, Katina, go to the next slide, if we're to make that assumption, or if we're able to ideally achieve that stage of continual input, it requires us to reframe the initial question we pose, which is, how do we design for kids? How do we care for kids in a digital setting? And the reframing of our question that we'd like to pose to you is, we need to think of initially as a sort of midpoint from that initial question, or as an evolution from that initial question, how do we design with kids, for kids? And that's really important, because if we are to embody all of those principles, those factors and those features of co-design and of systems theory and all the lens that we perceive our world or our challenge through when we think of things as a system, and as a system that requires participation and knowledge of environmental and other contexts, we need to be thinking about the with kids, for kids. And as I said, that's part of the development of the question, but there's still another step that I think we need to progress to. So Katina, if we go to the next slide, please. We need to revisit Katina's earlier slide about responsibility. And when we think about who's responsible for children, I'd claim, and we'd claim, that it's not an individual, it's not the child themselves who can self-regulate and use technology and is responsible for their use of the technology. The parent has a part to play, but so do other stakeholders and actors that Katina spoke about in the frame of a regulatory discussion. Now, if we think about all of these stakeholder groups, co-design must encompass these groups in addition to the child. So then we can start to think about whether it's from a user-centered design perspective or from a full-blown co-design perspective, we need to think of varied stakeholders as contributing to a co-design process and as assuming responsibility for children's care in an online setting. So that's responsibility for the design of the digital services themselves, and these stakeholder groups need to be empowered by systems designers and developers in the broader community to be able to provide input into these processes. So it's the technology itself, it's about education around the use of the technology, standards that govern digital services, and Katina will speak more to this as the presentation goes on, that each of these stakeholder categories may assume a different role and provide a different degree or a diverse degree of input into the Go design process. So as you can imagine, if we are to think of a student or a child as an observer, as a user, a tester, informant, or design partner, we can do a similar kind of thing where parents are concerned, where schools are concerned, companies and industry in general. And you can start to appreciate the different configurations that might occur or that might manifest themselves in this broader co-design process. So if we're to think about responsibility and overlay that with the initial and the evolved question, if we were to go to the next slide, Katina, our question naturally evolves to speaking about designing with children and other stakeholders for children. And I think that's the question we need to be asking, and that's the question we need to be framing our efforts around where care is concerned and where children and their use of digital services are concerned. Now, when we're designing for adults versus for children, particularly in a co-design kind of setting, there are special or complexities associated with the design for children. So there's obviously issues around consent, for instance, and the more traditional kind of aspects. But prior studies, which again we've cited and linked to for your information, have allowed us to determine a number of areas that require specific consideration in a co-design process centered around children as the primary stakeholder set. And they are around communication and articulation. So children, as opposed to adults, may have or experience challenges in being able to articulate in their requirements in the first instance or their experience, and might not necessarily have the required vocabulary to be able to express how they would like care to look in an online setting, which is where other stakeholder types or stakeholder groups and designers and facilitators of co-design efforts come in with their expertise and experience in guiding children to be able to articulate. There's also the idea about degree of formality. So prior studies and our experience in running co-design sessions with children show that you need less formality around these co-design processes. So to approach it in terms of a formal academic exercise does not work well with children. So I think we need to talk in the language of children and allow them to dictate the nature of our co-design sessions, where we come together in that hybrid or shared space to share knowledge around how we design to care for children where digital services are concerned. Also, I spoke about this earlier, briefly touched on it, the idea of flexibility as being key. So while we have a stringent and a well-defined methodology in place, we need to be able to incorporate an element of flexibility depending on what aspect we're co-designing. Now, validation and elaboration is also quite important, so we might need to provide additional guidance where that's concerned, and we need to also be able to account for inconsistencies, things to do with mood, things to do with setting, and a number of other factors which might direct a co-design effort in an unanticipated way. So we need to be able to validate that the results we're receiving are correct in order to design based on those results and based on those perspectives. And the last point is increased collaboration. So I think we need to acknowledge that children have a lot to offer in terms of co-design efforts. They need to be collaborating in that intergenerational kind of spirit to provide us with input, and we need to encourage a broader stakeholder set. Now, just to round off the discussion, Katina, on the next slide, I think something that we haven't really spoken about yet is public interest technology and its significance when in the context of kids and in the context of designing for children or co-designing for children. So if we step back from that co-design discussion, if we think about what public interest technology is fundamentally about, we can start to see a number of unique streams of thought, which are around developing and designing technology for good as an underlying premise. It's about social implications and risk or impact assessments early in the design processes. It's about, and this is reiterating and reinforcing ideas of participatory and co-design, it's about collaboration and and participation in the public interest. And that ties really nicely to both systems and socio-technical systems theory when we're talking about the idea of interest, common interest, public interest, and the ability to reconcile differing viewpoints that are for the betterment of society, or in the interest of a specific user group. In this instance, it's children, for example. And then we talk about the idea of having suitable regulatory provisions and anticipatory governance. So all of these are prerequisites, I think, for caring for children online. So our task moving on, I think, is to consider co-design within the context of a complex system. Think about it within the context of public interest technology in that broader field. And also to acknowledge the power of participation and empowerment of vulnerable groups, or groups that traditionally aren't represented in co-design efforts. And I think I'll hand over to you there, Katina.
Thanks, Roba. It's really interesting how you position the design process, the systems view, and then you've got the regulatory provisioning. But it all really starts with design. And that's one of the things that we're trying to achieve through a new standard working group that was just launched a few weeks ago, the IEEE P2089 endeavor, which is towards a standard that sets a benchmark for age-appropriate digital services. And it's a really lofty hope that we have in the group. I'm chairing that working group, and Roba, you're one of the voting members. And it's interesting how this was born about by the 5 right foundational perspectives. It's sponsored by the IEEE Consumer Electronics Group, that society, but it was based on the 5 rights. And those 5 rights include the right to remove, the right to know, the right to safety and support, the right to informed and conscious use, and the right to digital literacy, which is really aimed particularly at children, but also the general public as a whole. And so the standard is framed and centered around the following key areas: recognition that the user is a child. That's the first thing. Has considered the capacity and upholds the rights of children. How do you do that from a systems design perspective? Offers terms appropriate to children and in their language, I should say, presents information in an age-appropriate way, offers a level of validation for service design decisions. So show us how you came about through this design process, your end solution. Did you actually consult with children, with parents and other stakeholders? So the standard provides a specific impact rating system and evaluation criteria, and sets out how vendors, public institutions, and the educational sector can meet the criteria. It's not about mandating you should do this, A, B, C, D, otherwise there's penalties. It's more about providing benchmarks, and it's a guide. It's a hope that we all come together in the community, vendors, application, product offering specialists, public institutions and education sectors like schools to come about to meet the criteria that we're putting forward. But the future is now, right? So we've got Alexas out there, don't look like Hello Barbie girls or video Barbie girls. They're conversational bots, and sometimes they're a replacement for traditional toys. How do we design in that case? When children in a home, for example, would share an Alexa IoT-enabled device with their parents, or they overhear or oversee. What happens when parents are so overwhelmed by the digital services onslaught on themselves and their families, for example, their kids, that they give up the cause to care? Well, it's everywhere, it's normalized. I can't really tell my child what to do, so I'm not going to tell them anything. It's just easier to put a particular device in front of them and let them zonk out because they're tired after a long day of being online at work. When organizations, for instance, that produce products are making more money from exploiting us and our kids than the penalties handed out by government agencies for breaches in meeting particular benchmarks. So what happens when organizations don't really care about their corporate responsibility to kids or users or end users because, hey, I can deal with the $5 billion penalties as we've seen handed out by the GDPR? And what about when creating a government digital identity to try and ascertain whether the end user is a child or not, means that the child nullifies its anonymity online and its human autonomy? There are all these conflicting issues that we are facing at the moment with these emerging technologies. And so our future research is looking at the role of media literacy in the offering of digital products and services. For example, when does a child know what a deep fake is, and even when does a deep fake actually dupe a system. It is about systems design even at that point. The need for parents to be parents. We're not talking about prophylactic surveillance here. We're actually talking about adequate surveillance. The late lady, whose name just escapes me right at this moment, who wrote Kimberly Young, who wrote the 36912 guidelines for parents on how do they supervise and assist their children to go from no autonomy to autonomy at the age of 12, and to be responsible for their behavior online post the 13 years of age. That is an important guide. For instance, how do we utilize these things? Are they supposed to be left away in the dark, or are we supposed to be implementing them as parents or as guardians, for that matter? The need for private companies to act responsibly in the safety of children online. They shouldn't just point the finger at parents or at schools or at libraries or at public institutions and say, that's your problem. We're just offering a service. If someone abuses a service or misuses a service, it's not our fault. But in the defense of private companies, if we don't want to institute government identity IPINs, as has done in Korea, what can they do about it? And so when a company offers terms and conditions about who is an acceptable user, how do they actually supervise that or implement that? And then the need for governments and law enforcement to consider novel ways of maintaining anonymity of users, especially children, while encouraging secure online transactions that don't impinge on their human rights. So the question is, what privacy and security by design features can we embed in this code design process? As Anne Cavoukian always says, it doesn't mean we give up our identity if we can institute the right security measures that respect privacy through identification services. And then finally, regulatory penalties when principles are breached that are commensurate to the breaches. So if we all come into the same line of working, and private companies cannot claim that they didn't know or that they weren't able to institute age-appropriate services, then what? What kinds of penalties are introduced, or new legislation, anticipatory governments, guidelines that allow people to respond to these breaches? So integrated references for this presentation include work that Dr. Roba Abbas spearheaded on co-designing for the future with kids, for kids. It's our IEEE P2089 working group and standard for age-appropriate digital services framework, which was based on the 5 rights principles for children. And that 5 rights foundation is led by Baroness Beeben Kidron, based out of Britain. Some sources for our work, all the way from that stakeholder inclusive approach with children, the work conducted by Robertson and Abbas et al. On the engineering-based design methodology, the work again of the late Kimberly Young, who championed a lot of guidelines, early 2000s even, in 1995 with a netaddiction.com website, Children and Technology, Guidelines for Parents, Rules for Every Age. The work that I've done with Alexander Hayes and Emmeline Taylor on high-tech child's play in the cloud or smart toys as the stuff of nightmares, and how do we respond to that, and a few other blogging pieces on ubervalence.com that look at this new visibility of children and their presence online, who are now actually being watched by game developers through pinhole cameras on the laptop or the iPad or any real smartphone device, and then this continuous monitoring and buying in of a tick terms and condition. I don't know if you have any other last comments, Roba, to mention.
I think you rounded that up really well, Katina. Again, thank you for the opportunity to present. And any questions we're happy to take, and we welcome contact, I guess.
And I thank you, Roba, as well, and thank again Moira Patterson of IEEE Standards Association for the opportunity to bring together what looks like 2 disparate but actually very integrated approaches. One in the applied sense, looking at what is happening today through the use of caring online facilitation, and also the work on the co-design and how do we build better systems that Roba Abbas is leading at the Wollongong University in Australia. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you.